I really enjoyed speaking with Professor Bill McEvily, who is a professor of strategy at the Rotman School of Management. He has such great insight and ideas about networking and the importance of networking, not just for getting a new job, but for actually being more effective in our current roles. So I hope that you enjoy this interview. Okay, welcome to my lemonade stand. Today I'm really happy to be speaking with Professor Bill McEvily. He is the professor of strategic management at the Rotman School of Management, where he teaches courses on social networks, strategy implementation, and organizational theory in the MBA and the executive MBA programs, and courses on organizational theory in the PhD program. His research explores social networks as an organizational and strategic resource. And I thought he would be the perfect person to speak today about networking. So it's one of my favorite topics, speaking with one of my favorite people to chat with. And I think we're going to have a really good discussion around networking. So welcome to my lemonade stand.
Thank you so much for having me on the lemonade stand. I'm really thrilled to be here with you today and to talk about social networks.
Very good. So just to kick it off in terms of networking, and networking is a very hot topic for me because I think that it's such a valuable tool. And I think a lot of people don't like it because they misuse networking and they see it more transactional. A lot of us always know those people who are always there networking because they want something. They want a new job. Maybe they're in sales and they're looking for a new client. They need to be introduced to an influential person. It's a very, how can I extract value kind of activity. So, that's not something that it's fun to engage in. But what we want to talk about today is how networking is so much more broad than that. And the fact that we can use networking to actually make ourselves more effective as business professionals.
That's right. And this is the thing that I talk to my students about a lot. I think a lot about it. I research and write a lot about it. And usually, because I've been doing it for so long, I lose a little bit of perspective. I've gone a little nose blind on how interested people are in the topic or are not. But I usually kick off a session by saying, when you wake up in the morning and you put your feet on the floor, how many of you say to yourself, I can't wait to get out there and start networking? And it usually draws a few laughs unless it's a really tough crowd. But, the idea is that a lot of us, and I put myself in this category, sometimes really kind of feel uncomfortable or even anxious about the notion of networking. So my primary orientation, whenever I'm talking to a group about this, is to really kind of focus in on that, acknowledge it, and dispel it, and, really trying to just make it more human and more sustainable for us. Because and I think this is one of the things that draws people in, maybe part of what draws you into this topic, Dion, is that networks matter in incredibly important ways. I mean, and what I do work on and what I know most about is in organizations, like for things like career success, innovation, organizational performance, et cetera. But like as human beings, our health and well-being, I don't do this research, but I follow it because it's so fascinating, is so tightly intertwined with the kind of relationships and networks that we have. And even more broadly, our evolution as a species is intricately connected to this notion of the relationships and the networks that we have and how they have enhanced our survival possibilities. So if you're not at all interested in networks, my first message to you is that I think you should be. Because there's a lot of really important stuff that's linked up with networks.
And you're probably already in a network, whether you know you're in a network or not, you're in a network. And it's interesting when you talk so broadly about networking, because when we were discussing how we wanted to, what we wanted to focus on for this discussion, it is such a broad topic. And the concern is we could be here for 8 hours talking about all of the various different ways. So I think what triggered me first in terms of wanting to have this conversation with you is a video that's online for Rotman, where you talk about innovation. And I don't often hear people talking about the connection between having a strong business network and how that drives innovation. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about how having that deep business network really does help you to create those innovative solutions.
Sure, I'd love to touch on that. Just before I do, I want to back up because you said something that I think is really important, which is that we all have networks. Okay, so the first thing that I am very cognizant of when I talk about this topic is a lot of people don't like networking. And so I want to really, I want to sort of demystify that and break it down. And one of the ways of doing that is to say, well, you already have a network, so relax. Now, the thing is, how much have you actually thought about your network? How much have you thought about how effectively or ineffectively it's helping you achieve the certain goals and objectives that you have in your life, including the kinds of relationships that you want to have and the kind of relationships you don't want to have? Mm-hmm. So yes, you can, you can pause the video at this point and do something else, and you will still have a network. But if there's something about the way you've been going about it so far that's not quite entirely satisfying to you, then maybe there's a little bit more of it to consider and think about. And so let's go back to the topic about innovation. It's super important. It's super interesting. I kind of got interested in that almost by accident. I really got interested in it because networks is my primary interest, but then people kept saying things like, hey, this seems like it'd be important in organizations, and I started studying it. So the thing about innovation is one of the necessary ingredients, the absolute essential component for an innovation to occur is to have some sort of diversity of knowledge and ideas and insights, right? Because if you're just kind of replicating, that's not, by definition, that's not an innovation. Now, we can take some things that are already known and understood and combine them in new and novel ways. That too is an innovation. But the starting point is to recognize that diverse ideas is the absolute essential ingredient for innovation and creativity more broadly, and problem solving as well, to occur. Now, diverse ideas is a relative concept, which means me relative to you or you relative to some other group, right? So the ideas and concepts may not be entirely new to the world, but they may be new to you, and they may be new to the problem or the challenge that you're trying to solve. So there's a long history of research on networks and the role that they play in accessing and providing access to diverse ideas and knowledge and input. There's a classic study I want to mention. Sorry, I'm going to get a little wonky on you, but I have to acknowledge this because this is kind of where it really all began back in the 1970s. 1973, to be exact, was when the study was published. So it was done a little bit earlier than that. And it was by someone in academic circles who's famous. He's a sociologist. His name is Mark Granovetter, and he came up with one of the best titles of a paper ever, which is called The Strength of Weak Ties. And the idea for the study was to look at how people use their networks to find a job, specifically to find reemployment. They had sort of left their job or been laid off or something, and they were looking for a new position. And he thought, people's networks are going to be important to this. And they were, but he had a specific hypothesis in mind, which was that our close friends, what he called our strong ties, that was going to be the part of our network that was most important and most valuable. He went out and did his study, and lo and behold, he found the exact opposite. He found, overwhelmingly, that it was our weak ties that played a critical role, in that case, in helping these people find reemployment. So what he meant by a weak tie is somebody that we once knew, they were a casual acquaintance, but we pretty much lost touch with them. It could be somebody we went to university or high school with, we worked with them before, whatever. We hadn't seen them or talked to them in some period of time. They were incredibly important. That's surprising. Why is that the case? And he developed this idea of bridges in networks. And what he means by that is when you look at the way networks form, just like if we just kind of observe it and describe it, from kids on the playground to people in companies to politicians to all kind of circles and walks of life, you see the similar pattern over and over again. You get these clumps of people who are all very densely interconnected with each other, but they're relatively separate from and disconnected from the other clumps in the network. The thing that ties them all together into one large network are the bridges. Okay, so a bridge in the extreme case is that you are connected to a bunch of people, let's say here at Rotman, because you did an MBA here and you've got some friends that you know that are alums, and you have another circle of friends, let's say you were previously a banker, if I remember correctly, and you have a bunch of people there that you knew, but those two people don't know each other. Okay, the only thing that's tying them together is beyond relationships between them. So that's what we mean by a bridge. Let's go back to why this is so important for finding a job and especially for diverse information. So when you go to your friends, those are the clumps in the networks, and you say, hey, I'm looking for a job. Can you help me find something? Do you know of anything? They say, of course. Yeah. What can I do to help? I heard about this. Well, the thing about going to those people is that your close friends are also connected to your other close friends. And the information, the ideas, the opportunities that they know about are similar to the same ideas, opportunities, and things that other people know about. And that information diffuses very quickly, widely within that clump and cluster. But the other clusters that are on the other side of the bridge from you, there's a whole different set of information. Inside that other cluster, it looks like it's the same old stuff that everybody knows about, but it's only everybody in that circle. The bridges are the key thing that connect you in to those different insights, news. We call these echo chambers. Sometimes we're thinking about, cultural and political things where we have a very strong preference for seeking out information that is comfortable to us. We're already accepted. So that was the idea in the study. And from there, there's this long stream of research all up to today, and people like Bill McEvily in a business school studying innovation that have leveraged that idea. Where does diverse information come from? It's a function of the kind of networks that we have and those bridges, and the people that are sort of maintaining those bridges, we call them network brokers. Now, I'm going to seed an idea for you, and you can tell me if you want to go down this path a little bit further, or you probably have some other questions. Who are these people? Who are the brokers? Mm-hmm. And what makes them so special?
So, well, you've actually segued really nicely into the second area that I want to talk about, which is very much about those different pools of information and the bridges. Because if you recall, I shared a really brief story personal story where I wanted to get my kid into hockey. That's not a pool that I belong to. Would have taken me forever to kind of unravel and figure all that out. But I had a bridge to somebody who does, that's their network. And they were able to very quickly come back to me with very precise information. So again, just the efficiency of that. So yes, I would definitely like to talk about who are those bridges.
Yeah, so your example that you told me about, it's stuck with me because if I recall correctly, the person that had the solution to the challenge that you were looking to solve, which was skating lessons for your child, was about 7 minutes away by car.
Yep.
So this is one of the really intriguing things about accessing diverse information through bridges. It's not as though those people are way far over there on some other planet. Actually, this is the idea of small worlds, mm-hmm. and how close everybody on the planet effectively is through virtue of their networks. But the thing is that we don't know about it. The challenge is figuring out where is that diverse information, who are the people that have it, and then what's the kind of network that connects us to them? Mm-hmm. That's a more difficult problem to solve and a more challenging one to solve. And quite frankly, the little supercomputers we have in our heads aren't actually that well suited for it. The actual supercomputers are very good at it, and the algorithms that we've developed, provided that we have good data, which keeps getting better and better, especially given all the digital trace data of our interactions and purchases online, helps us do that. So, well, are there some heuristics that we can use that can help us get a little bit better at that and increase the odds that we're going to have access to that? I think the answer to that is most certainly yes. And so the place to begin for me is to say there's nothing wrong with connecting with people that are a lot like you, they're similar and familiar to you. There's all kinds of great benefits. And I talked about some health benefits before. Those are the kinds of relationships that you get a lot of those health benefits for. But the hard part is, and by the way, we tend to do that instinctively and naturally. It's not like we have to learn how to find similar people to ourselves. The hard part is to break away from that. And I think one of the tricks and one of the hacks is to think about, how is this person that's across from me right now who looks different from me actually quite similar? To try and imagine that. And so the last time we spoke, I was talking about walking into, the proverbial hotel ballroom to go to a networking event, a mixer at the end of the day of a conference or something like that, how intimidating that can be. What we instinctively do, go to the bar, try and find somebody we either know who looks like they might be like friendly with us or similar to us in some way. Imagine doing something entirely different. And I should probably try this myself sometime, is walking into that ballroom, doing the kind of scan like you're going to do. Our brains are already processing that and giving us sort of heuristics about those people for good or for bad. Mm-hmm. Imagine instead of doing what you instinctively do, doing the exact opposite. Mm-hmm. Going up to those people that for whatever reason, your brain has told you like, that person is least likely to be similar to you, and it's going to be the most difficult for you to find some commonality. And I'm willing to bet, I'd be surprised, in fact, if you didn't find that that person actually did have some similarities with you and some potentially significant ones. Because why on earth are they at this event that you're at if there's not some point of similarity? So that's an extreme way of pushing ourselves and testing ourselves to find similarity in unlikely places. I think that's a big sort of challenge. And by the way, I'll acknowledge that research has shown that's an uncomfortable thing to do interpersonally.
Yeah.
Why? Well, just in terms of like the small talk of how to get things started, we have a bunch of go-to things. And by the way, a lot of those go-to things are things that we can really relate to well because they're about us too. And you got to kind of abandon all of those. And you're like, well, now what do I have? How am I going to open up this conversation with this person? But getting more comfortable with that and practicing that, and to a certain degree, and embracing it, I think can be a pretty productive avenue into finding some of these bridges, establishing some of these bridges, and creating some diversity in your network.
But also it's interesting because that is very much uncomfortable for most people. And one thing that I do say is when you are in that, one of the things that is a foolproof thing that you could do in any setting is if you walk up to somebody with a pleasant look on your face, stick out your hand and say, "Hi, I'm Dion. I'd like to meet you." Like that's a foolproof way. Like nobody ever turns that down. And also counterintuitively, the person who's not like you is actually probably the more interesting conversation. And there's probably a lot more, because if somebody were to talk to me, and I'll just use hockey again, because it's not an area I'm really that familiar with, but then there's so many things to ask. So like, when did you get it? You know what I mean? Because there's so much I don't know. So It actually makes for and I think we talked a little bit as well about curiosity, like bringing that, like, well, I'm interested in learning more. And so yes, definitely it is uncomfortable, but it is very valuable when we put ourselves in that uncomfortable situation to get and there is also that cliche where they say we're more alike than we're different. And cliches are cliches because there's a lot of truth to them, right? So when you do dig underneath the covers, you do find all these different similarities. And I just want to touch on one other thing about that as well in terms of the value, because there's one very simple thing that I even found in my banking career that seems so simple, but it was something I don't find often happens, and especially people in corporations. So again, banks or corporations, when they do networking, they tend to network within the organization. And again, there's tons of people you can network with because these are large organizations. But the value is having a network outside of your organization, even if it's just another bank. So we would come up with certain situations where something, let's just say like a regulatory change comes out, and there are a bunch of different ways to address it. And it's like, one of the questions is, well, what are our competitors doing? And just the act, I remember being able to pick up the phone and call somebody at another bank and say, "Hey, what are you guys doing?" And these aren't corporate secrets. This is just, this is going to be publicly available information. They're like, "Oh, well, we're just going to change our terms and conditions." It's like, oh, okay, interesting. And that is, again, back to just a simple way that you're able to bring in more information and make yourself more valuable to the conversation by pulling in that information. So yes, it does. It takes effort, but it is very valuable to be able to take that step.
There are a couple of things that you just mentioned, if you don't mind, I'll briefly pick up on. So one of them, implicit in what we're talking about doing here, is I think a pretty radical shift in terms of what a lot of the advice and recommendations on networking are. You're supposed to have your elevator pitch down, and be very clear and succinct, and have a target and try and connect with that person, so on and so forth. And a lot of those things are just focusing on you, whereas what we've been talking a lot about is the other person. And so for me, the biggest shift is to turn networking around and make it not about you, and to make it about that other person. That's incredibly important. The other thing is that the point you mentioned about curiosity is fascinating to me and relates to that question that I posed earlier, which is like, well, these brokers, these people who seem to have a lot of these bridges and kind of be good at it, well, are they special people? Is it their personalities? Is it something about them? We've looked into the personality part. There's some support for that, but it's not overwhelming. And I've been doing some work recently here with a colleague, Tiziana Cacharo, a professor here at Rotman, and Evelyn Jang, who was a postdoc student here on that very topic, and really looking at the notion of curiosity very carefully and systematically in a very large scale study that we've done to try and understand that a little bit better. And sort of the high level takeaway, psychologists used to think of curiosity as a part of a personality trait, which it is, and there's strong support for that. But more recently, they've realized it's also something that can ebb and flow. So it's like a state that we're in at times, just like sometimes we're hungry. Well, sometimes we're curious. And they've also realized that there's certain ways of piquing the curiosity of people. So that's what we did in the study. We did an experiment where some people had their curiosity piqued, other people didn't, and we compared them and what that meant for their network. And we found pretty strong, compelling support that showed that they engaged in more of this bridge type networking behavior than the people who did not have their curiosity piqued. And it kind of makes sense when you think about it, because curiosity is like, I've got this question, I don't know what the answer is, and it's really bugging me that I don't have the answer. So there's like a motivational element. And we think what's happening here is that the networking hasn't gotten any easier. The stuff we talked about before, about how uncomfortable, difficult it is to meet somebody who's new and different from you, it's still there. But suddenly the benefit is raised because I have this discomfort of being curious, and I'm willing to make the effort to try and overcome the costs that are there. Mm-hmm. So that's a really interesting concept and idea as well.
So, and again, you set up a perfect bridge there when you talked about thinking more about that person and giving, as opposed to going in with this, how can I extract value from this particular networking event? So what I wanted you to touch on, so actually when I got connected with you, you actually ran the activity, the reciprocity ring for alumni, and that was actually when I got connected in with you and some of the work that you're doing. So I wanted you to share, because now I know that the reciprocity ring is something that Rotman does with all their incoming MBA students to kind of foster that whole mindset of seeing how we can contribute. So I wanted you to just share a bit about, high level, like what the activity is about and, what the responses have been with the MBA student community.
Sure, I'd love to talk more about that. And I'll say at the outset that the reciprocity ring is an exercise, a tool, activity, whatever you want to call it, that is licensed from a company called Give and Take. I've been using it now for over a decade here at the school. I discovered it not exactly by accident, but it's really my students that helped me fully realize the potential. I mean, I tried it out in a classroom exercise because students were saying, look, we want to do more of the practice part of networking in your class. And I said, okay, I've got the perfect thing for you. And they loved it so much, they said, I think we should be doing this for everybody in the school. And it took off from there, and we've been doing it ever since. The exercise is about giving. So back to this idea of turning network around and not making it about you, but making it about other people. And it's specifically about a form of reciprocity that's called generalized reciprocity, which is a little different than typical reciprocity. This is like paying it forward, doing something for somebody else because you can help them out, and you're not expecting anything back in return from them immediately. The way the exercise works is we get into small groups, ideally 20 people, thereabouts, and everybody has a chance to make one request. You can do it in 2 rounds if you want, but I usually do one because of time. And the request can be personal or professional. If you want to do 2 rounds, you'd make those separate ones, doing the personal first and then the professional. Everybody gets a turn to make a request and briefly presents that to the other members of their small group. Everybody listens to those requests and takes notes. And then after everybody's done presenting a request, everybody gets a second chance to now present offers of assistance. We usually ask people to try and make 4 offers to help the other people in their group fulfill their requests that they have. And after everybody presents, we kind of match them up, the offers with the requests, and we kind of look at what happened. And what happens is kind of amazing in my mind. It doesn't happen every time I do this, but more times than you would expect, there's this reaction of the group of saying, what are the chances of these 2 people being in this same group, and that one person needing ice skating lessons for their son, and that other person saying, I know this person who provides this great thing for ice skating for kids this age or whatever. It lines up so perfectly. But more generally, what happens is always in these activities and exercises, when I do them, people solve problems. And I mean important, real, personal, and business professional problems. And so you can see the value that happens right then and there. Not everybody as much. And occasionally, this is kind of rare, sometimes people don't quite get the assistance and offer of help that they get from a 20-person group, but the majority of people do. So you stand back from that and you say, what can we learn from this? First is thinking about making it about the other person rather than about you. Take what I just described of that giving activity and go back to the mixer in the ballroom and imagine you met somebody who solved this critical problem for you in that moment. And what are the chances of you remembering them, actually, forging a connection with them relative to somebody else that you had really pleasant, small talk and light conversation, but, by the time you get to your car, you probably don't even remember their name. So that's one thing about it. The second thing is you realize how exponentially resourceful networks are. Because in a group of 20 people, the number of people that they know, I don't know, it's in the tens of thousands and maybe hundreds of thousands. Mm-hmm. And those resources that are embedded in those networks are sitting there available, ready and waiting, which is one of the other big takeaways, that if you don't ask for help, you're not going to get help. But when you do ask, and this is true in most organizations that I've worked with, there are a lot of people who are quite happy to help. So the challenge is not getting people to be generous. The challenge is to get people to be vulnerable, to admit that they need help and ask for help in the first place. And it's been incredibly rewarding and exciting activity to do with our students. We usually do it at the beginning of the program where, of course, they're coming from all over the world. They're starting this new chapter in their life, and they're very eager and hungry to meet new people. And that timing works out very, very, very well. But I've also used it in companies and executive teams that have known each other for years. And in some cases, it works even better. And they're surprised to learn so much about each other.
Mm-hmm. And also, I just wanted to say, because you said that people are very surprised about some of the assistance that they get. But what I also have experienced, because I've helped out with some of those sessions, is people are surprised that the information they have is of value. And I'll give you like one simple example. Somebody needed a dog walker, again, brand new into the city, all this stuff, didn't really know their way around. And the other person just happened to know that there was a dog walking app. And it was just random information they just had in their head and had no idea that something like that would be valuable. So we sometimes undervalue the fact that just things that we know are of value to people who are just not in that pool of information.
I think that's a very compelling and concrete way of illustrating the point that you made earlier about the efficiency of networking. That sounds like a very transactional information economic thing, but just this person who knew about the app, it cost them nothing. It was knowledge that they had. It might have taken the other person a long time to figure that out. Mm-hmm. And that's what I mean about the resources being right there. And it's just a matter of tapping into them if we can. Now, the one other thing I'll say about this and my general view about building really powerful networks is that this is all doable. It's sustainable. You can make it comfortable for yourself, and it doesn't have to be this, the 6 things that everybody should do. There's a trade-off, though. The trade-off is that it's generally a long-term investment, or it can be a long-term investment. Sometimes, like in the reciprocity ring, you'll get help on an app right away, and you realize the benefit. But more often than not, having a really powerful network means making the investment over time and building it up. And when opportunities start coming to you without you looking for them, that's when you know you've achieved a very successful and powerful network.
Mm-hmm. And I think the other point, just so we don't miss it, we also talked about the value of it being a very generalized network. So it's not, as opposed to, I don't know, like I sell stationery. So I want to focus on people who are in that area within organizations because they buy stationery, as opposed to it being much more broad, where there isn't necessarily a direct line to how that person would necessarily be able to assist. It's really just building out good, a diverse business network.
It is. And this, again, is, I think, one of the hardest things for all of us to appreciate and value is like the building out part and really embracing that diversity. It's amazing how much we are prone to sticking with what's comfortable and known to us. There's one case that I use in my class that talks about a person who is extremely gifted at this kind of form of networking, of building the bridges, being diverse. And there's a line in the case that I always remember where he says, everybody you meet, has something that at some point might be interesting or useful or valuable to you. And his message was, you should take everybody as a serious opportunity for learning something. Mm-hmm. And, that reminds me of like my grad school days. And there were these courses that I had to take that I thought, I'm not interested in this. Really, I am not going to be a professor of thus and such. And lo and behold, in my teaching career, I've used some of this stuff over and over and over again. And I just didn't anticipate that. So I don't think it's easy for us to anticipate. So that's the other thing to accept is, yes, we have these pressing issues. That's part of why we network. But staying in the moment and just really trying to appreciate what it is like to learn about somebody else and their experiences and their expertise is important in and of itself, even if it doesn't help you solve your problem today.
And then I just wanted to close on a final point, which is about increasing our odds. And when you talked about things like the elevator speech, and again, elevator speeches have their time and place, but it is something that is premeditated, not in a bad way, but it's premeditated. So you're not just being your authentic self. You're remembering something that you crafted and probably had 6 people read it and tell you that it sounded good, as opposed to just meeting people as Dion and having a conversation. You talked about finding those points of commonality. So that's definitely something in terms of a tool that will help us to connect more in a more meaningful way with people, is to just be ourselves rather than being our degrees or our profession or our whatever it might be.
Yeah, and I think the hard part about that is coming up with some new like habits and routines that help us do that, because the habits and routines we have for going into a mixing event or meeting some new people, most of them are really good at like finding people who are similar to us, same stage of life or same career or things like that. But every once in a while I meet a person who like, they don't ask me what I do for a living. They don't ask me if I have a family. They ask me, what did you think about the Academy Awards or something like that? What on earth brought you to Toronto, or where have you traveled to lately? And they do it in a very sincere, genuine way. And the next thing you know, 20 minutes later, we're talking about the places we'd like to go. And it's a great conversation. And I say that in a very personal sense. I wish I was personally better at that. Mm-hmm. I think that's a real skill. And I think forcing ourselves to try it and practice it and develop that capacity potentially can increase the odds for building out those kinds of networks.
For sure. And when you were talking in the beginning where you start a lot of your classes by, talking about how much people dislike it, if it was more like that and having these really engaging conversations about topics that we don't typically talk about, I think people would warm up to it more and it would be more of an interesting endeavor that they're going into. And I actually use this great analogy, which is when I was a little kid, in the summertime, I was at the playground every single day. Like that was my job in the summertime. And it was always an adventure depending on who was there. Sometimes people's family was visiting and all this stuff because it's summer. But it was an adventure because it's like, well, who's going to be there and where's my day going to go based on who's going to be there? So it's similar, like walking into talking about that ballroom and thinking, I wonder who's going to be there and I wonder who I'm going to meet and what kind of conversations I'm going to have.
Yes. So yes. That's a great metaphor. I really like that. The one last thing I would mention on this topic, we've been talking about this in very personal terms, and that's how we naturally think about it. I think for some in your audience too, though, there's this other hat that they wear, which is the leader of an organization or a team. Mm-hmm. And thinking about what are the dynamics like on my team, in my organization, and how are people going about building networks? Because let's face it, intentionally or unintentionally, organizations do things all the time that relate to building networks. And, we have a lot of standard things that we go to. There's an orientation session, there's an onboarding, there's an offsite. Mm-hmm. And we just do those and accept that those are the ways that we connect with people at our organizations. And I think there's tremendous room to innovate and create tools, social tools, let's call them, that are a bit more intentional in creating the environments and situations in which these kinds of interactions can occur, at least increasing the odds of it happening.
Yes, I think you planted the seed for another discussion, because what I also know is sometimes when you have the offsite with your functional group to talk about your strategic plans and stuff like that. But again, how often is finance hanging out with marketing or HR or what have you, and those sorts of internal things as well?
Yes.
So, but I want to thank you very much. It's always fun talking, and it always goes in a bunch of different directions. So there was a lot of great ideas that you shared here. So thank you so much for your time. And
my pleasure.
Yeah, and I hope we find ourselves talking about this topic again from one of the other angles that we touched on today.
For sure, I'd love to. Thank you so much for having me on the Lemonade Stand.
Thank you. If you enjoyed that interview, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, My Lemonade Stand. You can also stream it off of your favorite podcast streaming platform. Looking forward to seeing you next time.